is Professor Kylie Message. I'm the head of the Humanities Research Centre at AU. And I'm delighted to be convening this event tonight with my colleague, Professor Fiona Jenkins, who's head of the Gender Institute at AU. I'll start by acknowledging and celebrating the first Australians on whose traditional lands we're meeting this afternoon. We're on unceded Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I also welcome any First Nations people who might be in the audience tonight. So we're here tonight to enjoy the 2022 HRC Gender Institute Annual Lecture on Gender. And it'll be presented by Professor Rob Kovar from RMIT University. Fiona will introduce Rob shortly. I thought I'd just give you a little bit of background about the Distinguished Lecture Series in the HRC for those of you who might be new to the series or to the centre. Tonight's lecture is the third in the HRC's annual Distinguished Lecture Series. There's a lot of kind of words in these titles, so I'll probably get a bit tongue-tied. The HRC Future of Haas Annual Lecture and the HRC School of Literature, Languages and Linguistics Lecture in Transnational Cinema were both delivered earlier this year. In the next couple of months, we're hosting the HRC Freilich Project Distinguished Annual Lecture and the HRC Cultural Institutions Annual Lecture, which will be presented in partnership with the Kluge-Ruhe Aboriginal Art Collection at the University of Virginia and the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth in New Hampshire. The Hans Moll Memorial Lecture in Religion and the Social Sciences will round out our series in 2022. Information about the topics and our speakers for each of those events are on our website, so I encourage you to have a look if you're interested. So the Distinguished Lecture Series has been around for a couple of years now, and it was designed to showcase and celebrate the excellence associated with interdisciplinary research and the partnerships that we prioritise in the HRC with other parts of the university and other universities nationally and internationally. We try and encourage speakers to these lectures who will give us a new way of thinking about a contemporary issue or a problem. And we very much encourage ideas and ways of thinking based on partnership, discussion, and nutting things out. So of course, interdisciplinary research is critical to many of those ways of figuring out stuff. And that's what we're here today to start to showcase and to provide a platform for. So collaboration and a commitment to supporting innovative advanced research in and across the humanities and our related areas, nationally and internationally, has been a key priority for the Humanities Research Centre since its conception in the early 1970s. So our research centre is nearly 50 years old, which is quite amazing. Our work, passion and our advocacy for the humanities across all fields continues to be as important today as it was 50 years ago. In fact, as you probably agree with me because you're here, it's even more urgent, I think, than it was 50 years ago. So we run a number of programs and events throughout the whole year, and again, our website's the best place to have a look if you're interested in those. Film screenings, podcasts, lectures, public events, heritage walks, sculpture walks. We do a whole lot of different things. We're always interested in doing more things and collaborating with new people. So please feel free to get in touch with me at any point. Just shoot me an email if you'd like to discuss any options or thoughts you might have. Now, the collaboration between the HRC and the Gender Institute, I think, might be one of our oldest or our longest lasting collaborations, and it's really set the model for the way we produce partnerships with other institutions in other parts of the university since. So we have a jointly funded visiting fellow annually, and that fellow usually delivers this distinguished annual lecture on behalf of both the Humanities Research Centre and the Gender Institute. Come in! tonight it gives me great pleasure then to introduce Rob. Well, actually I'm going to introduce Fiona, who's going to introduce Rob with a lot of introductions as well as a lot of words and titles. Rob is our shared joint fellow, and Fiona, of course, is the Institute's director. So thank you.
Okay. So I thought I'd just say a couple of words about the Gender Institute by way of introduction. Probably most of you know it's been going for quite some time. We actually launched in 2011 by Dame Quentin Bryce, which she did very gracefully and wonderfully, as you can imagine. And it was set up to promote just the incredible range of gender research that's happening around campus, and really to try and connect and foster the kinds of really interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary spaces that gender research often happens in. ANU is a very discipline-based university in many respects, and gender research doesn't often fit into those narrow kind of boundaries. So collaborations like the one that we've established with the Humanities Research Centre, and I'm trying to remember how long it's been going, but quite some time.
I was purposefully vague, because I don't know the date.
It's brought lots of wonderful scholars here. I was thinking, actually, our first scholar was Professor Lisa Adkins, who's now Pro-Vice Chancellor here at ANU. Marion Diva, getting them mixed up. Marion Diva, Lisa came as well. Of course, the editor of Australian Feminist Studies. So it's had a long, kind of interesting lineage. And of course, over this time, the meanings of gender have really shifted in multiple ways. It's amazing to think back over 11 years and how much really has changed, and sometimes it can seem like we're living in times when what gender is this really fast-moving puzzle that we're trying to keep track of, and if you're Gender Institute, you're really trying to embrace a lot of innovation, a lot of change, a lot of differences. And so it's very much in this context that I think we're going to get some very timely insight from our speaker tonight. I'm very delighted to welcome Professor Rob Kober, who's going to address this topic of 21st century genders and sexualities. He's visiting us from RMIT in Melbourne, where he's the Professor of Digital Communication, and has an amazingly broad and interesting research profile. Currently leads a number of major funded research projects on young people, health, well-being, and digital and broadcast media. And he's a very prolific author. I'm just going to mention a few of the things that he's recently published. So Queer Youth Suicide, Culture and Identity with Routledge in 2012, Emergent Identities, New Sexualities, Gender and Relationships in a Digital Era with Routledge again, and Flirting in the Era of Me Too, Negotiating Intimacies, which came out in 2019. So really interesting range of areas that you look at, Rob, and really looking forward to hearing from you. So join me in welcoming Rob.
Thanks, Fiona. Thanks, Kylie. Can I too please acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded lands on which we meet, and pay respects to the elders, past, present and emerging, and acknowledge that a lot of the work that I've done towards this has occurred on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri and Ngunnawal people as well. This might be a bit controversial, because I want to talk about what is perhaps the most seismic shift in gender and sexual identity that's occurred possibly since the late 19th century, and certainly since the 1970s. And that's the proliferation of gender and identity terms, labels, descriptors, ways of discussing and articulating relationships, and so on. Now, we've been used to, until about 7 years ago, the dominance of the 20th century models, which have been very, very binary based, the hetero-homo dichotomy, the masculine-feminine dichotomy, sometimes written as straight/LGBT, sometimes not quite using the language of cisgender, but certainly the sensibility on it of cisgender versus trans, and so on. Scholarship has always recognised that we can certainly go back to the 18th century to see where scholars have pointed to the messiness of gender and the messiness of sexuality and so on. But these binaries have remained dominant in public and political discourse across the 20th century and certainly into the 21st century until pretty much about 7 years ago, when it started when what I call a new taxonomy started emerging and being discussed in the public sphere. This is not a statistically sound way of describing the change. It's from an RC project I was involved in, which launched in 2015, which means we designed a lot of it in 2014. And in 2014, we really didn't have a sense beyond gender identities that were masculine, feminine, and trans. And we didn't have a sexual identity framework that was beyond simply using LGBTQ and 11 others. This is our recruitment for interviews, focus groups, and some survey research, which we put all together. It all happened around at various times in 2015 and 2016. And what we found, we were looking at two generations of participants, and we really wanted to tease out is what's changed in the everyday lives of people who identify by alternative genders and sexualities, from those who were born in the 1970s, i.e. came of age in the 90s approximately, and those who were born in the 1990s and therefore came of age around the 2010s. This really shows, in a way, the extent to which people chose other gender identifiers, like non-binary, like trans, like genderqueer, and so on. That the number doubled in that generational shift, so from about 9% to 20% of participants. And the same thing with sexual identity, where terms like demisexual, pansexual, and queer, which are becoming very, very familiar to us now, today, but we had not really expected to get more than a few, again, doubled across those two generations. A lot of the people we spoke to as well, who were from the older generation, had picked up the language and found, yes, this works better for me than the identity lesbian, or demigender is far more how I see myself now than the identity woman. And that was quite a common occurrence in our interviews and focus groups. And it was, to me, it was such a substantial surprise, the numbers and the fact that so many people in the interviews wanted to talk about it, that I wrote about it a couple of years later, really to try to find out how many identities are we talking about, how do these identities emerge, a bit of what I want to talk about today, the role of digital communication in fostering the environments for a kind of collective intelligence in which people who felt disenfranchised by the 20th century framework were able to develop new ways of thinking. And why earlier attempts had actually failed, like 1970s androgyny. Why was this not picked up? Why has this not continued through? Why did 1990s queer theory, which to me is a very, very powerful humanities framework for deconstructing gender and sexual identities, why did that not come through into popular discourse? And why did this rise, and why now? But I also want to talk about today the contestation and some of the aggression and adversity towards the new genders and identities and towards that framework that's emerged particularly in the last 2 to 3 years, which I didn't really write about at the time. There was criticism, but there wasn't this kind of anger that we're actually seeing now in a lot of settings, so I'll come to some of that. So what are we actually talking about? We're talking about hundreds, literally, of gender identities and sexual identities. These are just 2 screenshots from 2016, where people had started trying to compile what I call the taxonomy, the new taxonomy of gender and sexual identity. Lists and descriptions and definitions of what was circulating on, particularly on Tumblr, where the discussions were first emerging. This was my 2016 sampling, where terms that are, some are quite common to us, some aren't, but agender, non-binary, obviously, pangender. So some of these did circulate before that period, but not with the kind of verve and sort of emphasis that are sitting on trying to produce change. So, two-spirit is a much, much older Native American and sometimes translated from a Pacific Island term. Demigirl is much, much newer, describing an identity that is mostly woman, but not completely, and at times maybe less woman than other times. It's one of the ways in which that's often defined. Fog gender, which speaks a little bit to the public interest in neurodiversity as well. So fog gender is a gender identity that only makes sense in the context of a brain fog or an instance of brain fog. And it's a very, very meaningful gender to those who adopt it and practice it. Among sexual orientations, sexual identities, asexual is obviously one of the biggest that's emerged, moving away from the idea that asexual is a lack or an inability or a psychological problem to an identity that sits alongside other possible sexualities. Limno is another, which is a sexual orientation that is an attraction to drawings and art, but not necessarily to people or to bodies that one might experience in real space or unrepresented, unmediated. Sapiosexual is probably my favourite. So sapiosexual is an identity, an attraction to intelligent people, regardless of the gender that they might be or articulate be perceived to be, which I actually thought was everyone, but it turns out that some people find intelligent people very, very unattractive as well. That's what some interviews told us. I like to have a relationship with intelligent people. I like my friends to be intelligent, but I actually find them really unattractive. So that's quite framework. So that's what I was working with in 2016. This is what we're working with in 2021-22. This is just gender identities. It's just A to D. So the list is ever expanding, and that in itself is quite interesting. It sort of goes back a little bit to this idea, completeness of all time sexualities and genders so far. And I think this acknowledgement that, well, we haven't stopped, and there may be new emergences that actually come into play. So, I often get criticised for speaking about things that are a little absurd when I mention a few here, especially by people, well, by my mother actually. Although she's actually started to question her gender now to some extent. I haven't read some of these. But say co-gender, a gender that feels like it is on mute. Or duragender, a subcategory of polygender, which is gender fluid, bigender, or trigender, with an identifiable long-lasting gender that is more prominent than the other genders experienced. I like these kinds of definitions because these are about nuance and specificity. It's about what the older framework, the older knowledge framework, was unable to capture. And the same thing with the proliferation of sexual identities and sexual orientations. So where asexual had emerged with a sense of pride among some of this, you also get, say, grey A, which is a grey asexuality. Sexual orientation in which people don't normally experience sexual attraction but can sometimes. So again, slightly more nuanced and slightly less fluid than we might have spoken about sexual identities or attractions previously. At the same time, what we're getting is a new framework for thinking about attraction and relationships as well. So for a very, very long time, the distinction between sexual attraction and romantic attraction has governed our everyday lives. And there's not one person in this room, I'm sure, who hasn't sat down in a cafe at some point and spoken about or overheard a conversation about, it was like, well, look, I'm sexually attracted to them, but I think, maybe, I don't know, do I love them? Maybe it is right, maybe it's not. Or, I'm still in love with you, but I'm no longer sexually attracted to you, and so on. So there's always been that tension between those two, and, it governs literature, it governs, so much film, so much entertainment and imagery output, including for centuries. What we're looking at now, this is one person, or one common taxonomy of attractions. Sexual attraction, which is I want to have sex with you, romantic attraction, I want to date with you, but these four other kinds. aesthetic attraction. I don't want to have sex with you and I don't want to date you, but I want to look at you, and I'm attracted to looking at you, or looking at images or so on. Sensual attraction, I want to hug you, and it's like you're the person that I hug. And so some of my interviews would describe the kinds of relationships they would have, particularly in school or university, but not all of them went to uni. Where, look, this is the person I'm aesthetically attracted to, this is the person I'm sensually attracted to, and I spend a lot of time hugging them, but I also have a sexual relationship over here, and and I'm married, and have a romantic relationship over there, and so on. Platonic attraction, I want to be friends with you, which I think is very interesting putting this in here at all, the idea that friendship is perceived as an attraction. And it's perceived as an attraction that differs from sexual and the romantic. So one thing that's actually going on with this is a demand for clarity as well. So again, that very common experience of a friendship, look, I'm not sure if I'm romantically attracted to you or not, let's just be friends, and so on, which is always something complex and fluid and tenuous and anxiety-provoking and so on. By differentiating this, it overcomes some of the concerns and some of the anxieties that people feel. And altruist, which again is sort of another way of looking at nuance, emotional closeness that's neither platonic, there's neither friendship nor romantic, but sits in a grey area in between. So trying to put a definition on those kinds of relationships that so many of us experience with or remember or not or heard about, that is fluid and complex. So rather than that kind of, if people recall that old Facebook relationship thing, you could tick the box, it's complicated, which is now long gone, thank you. This is a way of getting over that complicatedness. It's a way of putting a terminology to that it's complicated element. Now, the responses, these are the responses that I get when I talk about these in some settings. I don't know if you're not here though. First is that these are just theatrics. This is just young people attention seeking. That's not the case. In talking to people about this emergent set of identities, these are deeply felt attachments. These are meaningful, they're performative, they're negotiated, reiterative, and they're sustained. They may be changeable, and people will change among different identity categories with a lot of thought and a lot of consideration, and in many cases a lot of discussion with others, with peers. But they are just as meaningful as older terminology like lesbian, gay, bisexual, and so on, or masculine, feminine, etc. They're not just online. This is the other criticism that often comes about. This is just what people are doing online, but they're really lesbian, they're really women, and they're just adopting this there. Now that real virtual distinction hasn't been meaningful for a long time, and it possibly never was meaningful, but this is not how we engage with digital settings at all. Which is not to say they've completely collapsed into each other, but there's certainly a lot more flow between what we consider the real and consider the digital. So they're not just things that people do online, they're articulations in everyday life. All of it is that these are just a tiny number. Just ignore these attention-seeking people. It's just this tiny handful of loudmouth people who think they're snowflakes and unique and so on. That's what the terms like it's used. Now we don't really have credible, quantifiable data to say, well, this many people identify as gay girls and this many people are sapiosexual and so on. But what we do know is from attempts to produce statistics in the US, Canada, Brazil, and Switzerland, somewhere between 1 and 2% of people identify as non-binary. A further 1% of people use one or two of the other terms. So 3% of the population, which is very, very sizable in those settings. And around 4 to 5%, I'll talk this up, but 4 to 5% of people using the broad range of sexual identity terms that's not gay, lesbian, or heterosexual, straight. So sizable numbers ultimately. It may not be a majority, but it's still large. At the same time, what we see then is a generational shift. But I don't want to put too much emphasis on the idea of generations at all. But one thing we found in the pre-generation study was a lot of the people in the older group, the people born in the 1970s, would discuss their identities. I identify as lesbian or gay or as queer or bisexual, or as a man or a woman, but, and then give a description, and the nuance would come out in a complicated sentence related to experience, related to a desire to confess, to clarify. It's like, yes, I mean, however this has happened into my life. So there's a looking for you in a particular way. Now, the younger group, though, would speak in terms of this taxonomy, so it's using a descriptor in order to provide clarity with greater efficiency as well. So you get phrases like, I identify as bisexual, previously I was identifying as lesbian, but then my partner was like, I'm non-binary, and I was like, okay, so I need to readjust to re-identify here, i.e. because I'm attracted to a non-binary person, so therefore I can't really be bisexual because that's possibly a third gender in my repertoire of attractions, and therefore I need to think about a new way of identifying. And that was quite a common occurrence there. I'm 22 and I identify as asexual, so that was a learning process for me, going through high school, just figuring that something was just fucked up, but figured out a couple of years ago what it was. So the not matching one's peers' articulation of the attractions that they were experiencing, but not necessarily having the terminology to be able to describe it. And the one I like, I identify as gender fluid. I'm demisexual, biromantic, panromantic, but I've always gone by bi, so I just say biromantic. I'd like to study youth work probably next year. I've left in that last phrase because I don't want this to look like it's something that applies as a phase that, say, younger people are going through and will grow out of, which is a common kind of statement you get. But that these are people who will be educating youth and working with younger people in the future as well. This framework will be adopted by future teachers and so on, which is great. But it's something that will undoubtedly travel up with a generation as part of a generation's culture and proliferate in that way. So, how does this come about? Now, I've spent a long time trying to understand why and why now. And really, one of the useful things for me to do was to turn to some 1970s work by cultural studies theorist Wayne Williams in his book, The Long Revolution, where he developed a framework for cultural change that he described as the residual, the dominant, and the emergent. There are three elements that occur in everyday culture simultaneously. So the residual is formed in the past, but it remains active in the cultural process, even though it doesn't logically fit there. So the Queen, the royal family, is a really good example of the residual. Formed in the past, active in the cultural process, and if you read any newspaper at any time, clearly very active. The entire royal family is in the public's interest in it. But it doesn't really have anything to do with our contemporary parliamentary systems, with parliamentary democracy, with a liberal capitalist society, and so on. But it remains part of the picture. The dominant, the values that embody the majority, the saleable, and the emergent, the new practices that are not necessarily consciously developed, but come out of the dominant, often to challenge it, and if the conditions are right, may replace it. So this is one framework of thinking about cultural change that I think tends to apply quite well to the emergent taxonomy. So if we try to link that up, we could speak about the residual as being misogyny and homophobia, which of course has not gone away in any respect. Structural misogyny and structural homophobia are still very much part of the picture. But they are, in our dominant, everyday, liberal humanist culture, considered something of the past as much as they remain active in the process. They certainly themselves, this is something negative, this is something terrible, what are we going to do, catastrophe. But crisis is always formative. It's a new balance of forces, the emergence of new elements, the attempt to put together a new historical bloc, new political configurations and philosophies, a profound restructuring of ideological discourses. And this is really what I think that we're seeing at play, a profound restructuring of gender and sexuality. It may fail, it may not. matter in 10 years? We might look back on this in 10 years and say that was something that was done and it was justified after all, but I don't think so. I think that what we're actually going to see is that profound restructuring, and it is going to be the most substantial shift that we've seen, certainly in our lifetimes. The second condition, though, that makes the labels possible is a demand for authenticity with certain kinds of intersectionality. And this is where the fluidity question of 70s androgyny or bisexual experimentation or queer theory in the 1990s was seen as a problem. It was too contingent. It was too fluid. It didn't provide the opportunity for people to express an authentic identity. So it's this is where part of that older dominant remains in place in what we've actually seen emerge as well. The demand for a coherent identity. That very, very, the state to be a bit, but the Oprah requirement to confess, who are you? What is your identity? That is part of our contemporary Western cultural framework for communicating with others and for relating to others. So it's a demand for clarity, and hence having these very explicit categories gives an opportunity for greater clarity than would otherwise be the case. And the third element here is populism. Now, I want to be a bit careful with how I use this, but I don't want to sound like I'm saying that this is sort of Trump populism or other horrific aspects of populism that we've been seeing over the last 5 or 6 years. But there is certainly an element to this of a cultural populism that is a disavowal of the institutional, a disavowal of the received wisdom as having been a failure, of the feeling of being underrepresented and not understood, of being disenfranchised and therefore trying to find a new world view that is not part of what is perceived of as the elite. And certainly this is part of the practice we've seen by necessity around medicine and health service provision among trans persons who have found that the current institutional arrangements fail, and that there needs to be a new language and a new discourse at play. And so it emerges in this very grassroots way. With these three intersecting is one way of perceiving how this change actually comes about. Then think a bit about the criticisms that are at play. There are 4 that are, a couple that are legitimate, a couple that are not. The first 2 aren't really, but these are where it's been in the early years of this emergence. A very, should we say, non-violent kinds of criticisms mostly. The first being simplistic and ridicule. The idea that if we start allowing people to choose a gender identity rather than this is what you are, this will be best if it says, and so on, then people start identifying as cats. And this is trotted out by the occasional senator in Australia, the occasional congressperson in the US, and the very rude word that I won't. The occasional person who just wants to be very, very angry and aggressive about anything at all. People are identifying as cats. There are people who are identifying as cats, and there are people who are actually seeking surgery to have cat's ears and fur and so on and a tail. I think that's something completely different as well. We're not talking about the same kinds of numbers. We're not talking about that 2, 3, 4, 5%. We are talking about something very, very complex as well around body dysphoria and so on. But I don't want to say that necessarily people don't have a right to identify as a cat. It's a bigger argument, it's a different case argument. You also get this problem of the alphabet soup claim. Was it alphabety spaghetti, the little tins of, I'm praying for that, which is quite horrible, but the idea that if you we're adding too many letters, it's LGBTQIAA+, and this is ridiculous, I can't keep up, I hate this, let's go back to what we used to have. And that's really obviously disavowing something that's being done. You do get a political criticism about it. This one's a little more important, and it certainly happened among the leadership in marriage equality in Australia, who were actively asking people to put aside the new identity categories because it's not strategic at this time. It's not helpful to say that the way that the marriage equality debate is being framed is something that leaves people out. That let's get this through and come back to it, which is not necessarily always a good way of doing strategic politics. To say these issues are not meaningful and not important now, but maybe in the future we can do it there. So it was a common criticism of this coming from that sort of more, should we say, more conservative LGBTQ politics. There have been some justice claims. I think these are a little bit more meaningful as well. The new labels are primarily available to be expressed by a more comfortable middle class with the freedom to experiment beyond tight political conditions, i.e. this is not something we could do in Crimea or Ukraine at the moment, or parts of India at the moment, where people are struggling for very survival for life, struggling to decriminalise sexualities and so on. Now, I don't entirely agree with Lenore Bell on this, because I don't think it's necessarily a comfortable middle class. I don't think this is necessarily something that's often criticised. It's just a uni thing, because it's certainly out there in other settings as well. So I don't think it's necessarily, we should align it with class in that way. Or the other Lenore Bell's other criticism is that it's found on competitive claims about who is more oppressed than the next. This person, well, I'm asexual, so I'm more impressed than you because you're asexual and so on. Those debates aren't really seriously happening in the way that Norvell had spoken about them with quite a lot of attention in the US about 3 or 4 years ago. There is an argument there, and I think it's an important one to pay attention to, but I don't think it's one that we necessarily need to worry about. What I'm a little bit more worried about is surveillance. Certainly among some of the digital ethnography work I do in this space, I see a lot of boundary policing online. So it's where someone has identified on Facebook or Tumblr or Reddit a person who says, look, I am demisexual, say, or I'm non-binary. And that person someone else has responded and said, no, you're not. You're not this. And I went through your Facebook feed, and here's some screen caps from a year ago, and here's a screen cap from 3 years ago, and you are clearly not that, you are that, you are something else. And you can't identify with this because you're oppressing my identity by trying to come in on this particular one. And that's where I think it's a little more concerning around what I call the intensive labour of doing gender and sexuality today, and the kinds of anxieties people were feeling trying to ensure that, look, I identify with this way, how much labour do I need to do to check, is this legitimate for me? Am I going to trip myself up by having something in the past that says I wasn't this? How do I produce this identity descriptor for myself that is both forward-looking but also has a trajectory into the past that needs a clean-up as well? So certainly there's a lot of anxiety around that now, I don't know how much time I've got, maybe a few minutes. Hi, let me talk about where the antagonisms become a little more violent. Now, a lot of the work I've been doing over the last couple of years really is around digital hostility, which I think is actually perhaps one of our biggest social issues for the 2020s in general. What we know about digital hostility is that we're no longer talking about the cyberbullying of a decade ago. We're talking about something that's a lot more toxic. 14% of Australian adults, according to the Safety Commissioner, have been subject to hate speech or pile-ons, where thousands of people coming on Twitter to criticise or shame the person, or trolling and other forms of online adversity. According to Amnesty International, 50% of women in the United Kingdom have reported to the end of their surveys they've experienced harmful online behaviour. The Special Rapporteur on Minority Issues at the UN has spoken of a tsunami of hate targeting minorities in online settings. And there is a known link between suicide and experiencing shaming pile-ons as well. There's certainly a number of very high-profile cases, so it's a very, very serious issue. And it's no surprise, really, that people using terminology from the new taxonomy are often targeted directly in this way. Often just by being called, woke or snowflake, two terms that have now become terms of abuse. But in general, doing it to contest the legitimacy of this framework. So it's some of it's harmful and some of it's problematic, but most of it is around the question of legitimacy. There are also threats, and this is the bit that's been alarming me since about 2021, and particularly in North America. People who are actually saying, it's like, you say you're non-binary, non-binary doesn't exist, this is against God, you're possessed by Satan, and I'm going to kill you. And that's becoming more and more common in online settings, in particular parts of the world, where I think that would be quite a frightening sort of threat for a young person. So that really is all around that question of legitimacy. Second, this is where it shifts from the violent critique of the legitimacy to making the lives of gender sexual minorities the subject of political debate. And it's binary affirming lobby groups. The Australian Christian lobby, who I think the less said about the better usually, they have been very active in this space. Part of it's a focus on teachers and what young people are being taught in schools, but a lot of it is a focus on gender diversity as well, which again, the work of saying something problematic, progressives, etc. And the Australian Christian lobby is something to worry about in a way, because they built a very powerful machine in Australia to combat marriage equality. They failed, but that machinery continues to exist. The network is there, and the attention, as we worried about at the time in marriage equality, being that the attention returned to other areas and to other minorities, has certainly happened. So, this is something that they moan about endlessly. Non-binary people and gender diversity. TERFs, trans-exclusion radical feminist groups, who again, very occasionally have a legitimate argument to make. It's certainly a more sophisticated argument than the Christian lobby. I don't want to say that their position is legitimate in any way, but that the argument is actually certainly more sophisticated and requires a more sophisticated response, but it is something to be concerned about. The one thing that has concerned me for the last couple of years is the TERF lobby and the Christian lobby working together actively, i.e. meeting together, to combat gender and sexual diversity, and that becomes an even more powerful machine. From two sides, two groups of people who you would never have imagined could actually sit in a room together. So that is concerning. You also get these other weird little lobby groups that set up, like Binary Australia. They're there to promote and celebrate the inherent difference between boys and girls. I don't quite know what they're going to do other than having the most boring website that has ever been created. They'll probably have pride parade, binary pride of some kind. I don't know, people dressed as princesses, army people, or whatever, but to show the inherent differences among boys and girls is their campaign. They may be, they may just are very likely to just disappear. Now, where it shifts from the public debate then to a conspiratorial perception around school curriculum. And the idea that schools have been infiltrated, and sort of the curriculum in education has been infiltrated by the progressives who are trying to trick children into very strange identities and so on. Mark Latham has capitalised on this quite a lot in very strange ways. Certainly when the Safe Schools coalition debates were happening a few years ago, about 3 or 4 years ago in Victoria and elsewhere, Mark Latham, so now One Nation, former Labour leader, his concern was that this was a direct result of cultural Marxism. Now, I don't quite see how his argument worked at all. This is more a situation of pulling keywords that create alarm as a form of dog whistling to create anxieties and conservative stress around something that they think is happening to young people. Certainly in the States, though, the school district public meetings have been overwhelmingly overwhelmed by people who very often don't actually have children in that school, or any children at all, but who turn up because they want to speak to the issues of curriculum. And it means that these boards that are there to assess community views in order to do their business and strategise and so on, can't get any work done because people are there to talk about this terrible thing that's actually happening, and they're often crying while they're giving their angry speech about why this is all bad. I had a bit of a pause in this though. If there's anything about mask wearing or vaccinations, they'll concentrate on that instead. But they certainly, as that's dissipated, returned to this issue. And weirdly, they link it with critical race theory as well. Again, trying to put words that alarm people there. And there is work, but it's not the level they think. A lot of the time, this is around a claim to parents' choice, a discourse of parents' choice, rather than the idea that the community might benefit from talking about diversity or having some kind of engagement around this, or having schools that have a certain sense of social harmony and inclusiveness. This is my choice. I will choose whether my daughter will identify by any other gender than the one that we have given her or not. And that's been really a major part of the picture. Now, to shift from conspiracy to outrage, or possibly I should just say shift from conspiracy to absurdity, is the discussion around toilets. And this obsession for the last 4 or 5 years around who should use what toilet, what happens when a trans person uses a toilet according to the identity that is felt as opposed to the identity on a birth certificate. What happens when we start having non-gendered toilets or unisexual toilets, or people using the disability toilet and so on. There's often an assumption that public toilets are and always have been gendered, which of course they're not. It's certainly the case in Denmark, Sweden, Scandinavia, where it's very, very common to find public toilets that are gender-free, everyone uses them, and works fine, has worked fine for years. A lot of this uses disinformation on the idea of rape, and we quite often see these cases come up. They're utterly falsified, but I know someone whose daughter was raped by a person disguised as a trans person in this particular toilet. This is certainly not happening. Certainly there are no police reports that RMIT been able to find on these kinds of cases. So a lot of this is around the performativity of outrage, in the way that we see in other kinds of conspiratorial settings as well, particularly around cognitive. And now, when we move from outrage then to the subsuming contestation into arguments around protecting society, this is where I'm certainly a lot more alarmed, well, even more alarmed than the first 4. So as it becomes more and more violent. Now, I did not want to talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene ever. So first-term congressperson in the States, held no committee positions, but is being touted as the next speaker. She might be, but I think she might be the next speaker, and maybe after the November election, hopefully not. She put forward a bill on Monday, the Protect Children's Innocence Act. You could not get a more cliched title for this, but it's focused on young people receiving gender-affirming healthcare and schools that permit forms of gender play and so on. What she's doing is contesting any kind of contingency or agency or capacity to transition. And it's grounded, as is very often the case when this goes into legislation, in the idea of biological sex as opposed to any other way of framing gender. Now, her bill will criminalise anyone who performs any kind of gender-affirming surgery, who administers or prescribes any kind of hormone to a person under 18, including puberty blockers, which are absolutely vital to the program of transitioning for young people, and absolutely vital to the mental health of young people who have expressed a desire to transition. And this is known and it is serious and it's very, very important that these are available. For Taylor Green, mandatory prison sentence for anyone who does any of these things are 10 to 45 years, which is certainly a lot harsher than a lot of other crimes I can think of, like carrying a major weapon or something in those sorts of things. So this is where it becomes very, very concerning, because it's not just the subsumption of this new taxonomy into public sphere discourse, but into legislation as a way of contesting. So it's the dominant fighting back with every weapon that it possibly has across all of these five. And these are violent. Now, I don't want to go on for too long, but just to say very, very quickly, I'm identifying these as violent, but I don't want to say that this is necessarily a violence to individuals. I want to say it's something even more serious than that. And I want to put forward very quickly, and there isn't really time to do justice to this, but an ethics for why it's important to curtail the kinds of violence that disavows emergent identities and diversity. So it's not about violence towards individuals who adopt these identities. Individualism is how it's going to be talked about, but it's a problem. Individualism founds free speech and freedom of expression, which is important to the very way in which people talk about the agency of these identities. But it's also anti-interdependency. It often speaks of the right to injure others, the self-defense argument, and so on. Working with some of Judith Butler's recent work on non-violence, we know that part of the issue around acknowledging that everyone on the planet is interdependent, but it only really works to prevent violence if we acknowledge that every life is grievable equally, that any life that will be lost in the future must be grieved equally. That is not that some lives are more grievable than others, which is, again, a dominant framework. So any act of violence at all assaults the living interdependency that is or should be our social world. So if we're interdependent, we only exist because others exist, we exist in relationality with others, and the harm that is done to one group is a harm that is done to all, to put it in very, very simple language. Now, I tend to want to take this to a deeper step, and this is what some of the work that I've been doing lately has been around. Moving from this question of interdependency to where that interdependency takes place. It takes place in the world. It takes place in the world that is cohabitative. It takes place in what I call an ecology. An ecology that allows a diverse population to thrive, to have livability, to not feel suicidal, to have a right to not have violence done to them. So the violence, let me just read this bit. The violence of contestation by people like Martin Taylor Green, the violence of contestation towards emergent sexual gender minorities is a violence not towards individuals or to our bodies in interdependency, but towards the ecology itself in which diversities emerge. So it's an ecology of unwilled proximity to living in a world with people we don't necessarily understand, whose identities don't necessarily make sense. An unchosen cohabitation on the planet in spaces, political frames, digital platforms, and the globe. So any act that disavows the agency to express one of these emergent gender and sexual identities damages the ecology, it toxifies it. So all of these, between digital hostility, the lobby groups, the questions about school curriculum, the freaking out about toilets, and now the legislation, are all doing a violence to that ecology that should be allowing diverse identities to thrive and to foster. And so that really has to be our target, preventing those violences in order that we can have a world free from the toxicity in which the exploration of identity becomes a norm. Now, I should probably end in about 1 minute. Look, I might just end on that point. There's a little bit more around implications I want to talk about, but maybe ask if you're really particularly keen on hearing sort of about the health implications and the education implications and so on. I'll say thank you.